Thank you all for joining me tonight here. It's such a lovely room and such a big room as well. So many people involved tonight. So first of all, thank you to the organizers, to the people who make the Gandhi lecture series possible, and to all of the new friends that I'm making already here. And thank you to you, especially the students who could be out on a Thursday night, the last Thursday night with decent weather, or heading home to go for holidays or what have you. I plan to talk, as was mentioned, about how the changing climate is starting to cause growing numbers of people to lose their homes and livelihoods in many parts of the world, including here in Canada. But I don't want to dwell solely on the problem, or the challenge as I like to frame it, but I also want to talk about the pathways, the solutions pathways. And so that's where I hope to get to in this lecture. Just realized I've got my notes over here. That doesn't help. But I want to start, if I might, by speaking a little bit about the person after whom this lecture series is named. It's always a little bit anxiety-inducing to see your own name everywhere and these monitors next to the Mahatma's name. It's kind of like, even though we have no connection, there's still this, you feel a responsibility to honor what that individual represents, not just to his home country, but to the world and the principles by which he lived his life and tried to encourage others to follow. So I thought I would try to honor Gandhi by speaking about what he means to the environmental movement, the modern environmental movement, and to the way we think about the environment here in Western tradition. And actually there is some cross-pollination between the two schools of thought. And so I'll start by showing you this stick that I brought. It's an unremarkable stick in and of itself, but I collected it in the spring of this year, in March, in a small lake in eastern Massachusetts. It's a lake called Walden Pond. I don't know if any of you have heard about it or read a book by that name, but it's a National Historic Site in the United States, and it's actually a place of pilgrimage. A place of pilgrimage to a philosopher by the name of Henry David Thoreau, who lived in Massachusetts back in the 1800s. For those of you who don't know who Thoreau is, he built a small cabin on the banks of Walden Pond and lived there from 1845 to 1847. And I found this stick floating in the water of Walden Pond just near where his cabin was. So you shouldn't take stuff from national historical sites, I know, but it was just a floating stick, right? So nobody would miss it. So it's a bit of a talisman for me. But Thoreau was became known as a transcendentalist. So transcendentalism was a philosophy practiced by scholars, by writers, by people of the arts in Massachusetts back in the 1800s, and it drew a lot of its inspiration from the religions of South Asia, particularly the Upanishads, one of the early scriptures of modern Hindu religion. And so their belief, the transcendentalists, was that if you wanted to experience God, if you wanted to experience enlightenment, if you wanted to live well, going to organized religion was not going to answer your desires. The best way to do so was to live simply and to be in nature. And so Thoreau decided he would practice what he preached. And so he built this cabin, and there's a little shrine here, as you can see. All these rocks that you see piled up in the image there, people who walk up to the cabin site, they deposit a rock there, sort of in memory of him. And so as you can see from the text that's on there, this is a passage from the book Walden that he would write afterwards of his experience, where he said he went to the woods to live deliberately, and to face the essential facts of life, and to find out if he could learn what he could learn from living in the woods, and not to discover that when he had died he had not lived. And so he grew some beans up on the hillside. He didn't live like a hermit per se. He would often walk into the nearby village of Concord and exchange a few beans or a little bit of money. He came from money. His family owned a pencil factory. And he lived for 2 years, but spent most of his time just sort of paddling around on the lake and observing nature and writing about it. He wrote a book called Walden, or Life in the Woods, which not too many people actually read in his time, but it has become a de facto scripture of the modern environmental thought, at least in North American tradition. I was talking to one of our colleagues today, and it's an assigned reading in many classrooms around North America. It's not always the most engaging reading, but apparently Gandhi had it on his bookshelf. He too was a very learned, educated person, very well trained in Western philosophies as well, and so I read an article that someone observed that he had Walden on his bookshelf. But it was not actually Walden that links Gandhi to Thoreau as tightly as an essay that Thoreau wrote called On Civil Disobedience. And so what happened in 1846, I should back up a little bit. Thoreau never paid his taxes, even though he came from a bit of money. And that wasn't just because he was trying to dodge his taxes. He actually very publicly would tell people, I'm not paying my taxes, because he did not wish to fund a government that had legalized slavery. And so he said he would not pay taxes until that was abolished. And he was quite vocal about this. He would be a public intellectual today. But the authorities just kind of didn't, do anything about it until in 1846, the United States invaded Mexico and started to seize territory from Mexico. And so Thoreau started agitating in public about the illegality of the war. And so at that point, the authorities got fed up with him and threw him in jail, thinking that that would teach him a lesson. He was bailed out by one of his relatives within a couple days, but instead of teaching him a lesson, he wrote this essay on civil disobedience. And so in it, what he said essentially was that any person who believes in justice and who believes that the government that represents them is acting unjustly has a duty of conscience to disobey that government. Now, he wasn't necessarily professing peaceful disobedience, but certainly disobedience. And Gandhi did read this treatise, and he actually gave interviews about this essay. He wasn't the only one who's read it in history. Martin Luther King read it, many others as well, who have led peaceful opposition to governments and regimes that are doing evil. But Gandhi had read it, and I think when I read the interview, there was this idea that maybe this a middle-aged, bearded white guy from the United States inspired Gandhian thought. And I don't think it's like that at all. I think more, having read through the linkages, I think Gandhi felt comfort in the fact that his philosophy of peaceful non-cooperation with an evil regime was something that other people had arrived at in other ways, in other contexts. So it's not a case of Thoreau inspired Gandhi so much as Gandhi found comfort in reading Thoreau, as he peacefully and successfully, in the end, brought about the end of British colonialism in South Asia. Of course, there were other challenges that emerged from that, but nonetheless. The point being is that there is a clear linkage between environmental thought, inspired by Thoreau, and Gandhian notions of what is a just society and how to achieve one. And so we are at a time where peaceful non-compliance is becoming more and more prominent with every day. I don't think I need to tell any of the young folks in this room who Greta is, but for those who don't know who Greta Thunberg is, she's no longer in school, but she was a high school student who started a weekly strike against school in Sweden against trying to get that government to honor its commitments to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And so, obviously, she's inspired lots of people around the world, including my own kid and others. This was taken, this photo here, in Waterloo just before the pandemic. This would have been September 2019, and you can see that Thunberg had really inspired people, and not just in Waterloo, but I'm sure in Hamilton, I'm sure down in Gage Park, there were demonstrations, and all around the world. And so that's what brings me to the topic about which I wanted to talk to you today, which is how concerned should we be about the impacts of climate change? Are we at a moment in time where peaceful non-compliance is necessary to achieve what we need to achieve in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions and protecting the climate. So that's where I'm going with this lecture. And so hopefully I've done a little bit of honor, or at least brought out a little bit of recognition to the person after whom which this lecture is named. Okay, so if you spend any time on social media, you will see that, you will read that climate change is a hoax, right? All you have to do is spend a little bit of time on Twitter or, well, just about anywhere, right? You'll see Donald Trump, the former president of the United States, was quite proud to boast of the fact that climate change was an elaborate hoax. Now, I don't know who actually would start such a hoax, but anyhow, it's not a hoax, and it's not even a particularly new science. It's actually a rather old science. Going back into the 1700s, scientists believed that there must be trace elements in the atmosphere that trap heat near the Earth's surface. The challenge in the 1700s was they didn't have the instrumentation to prove it, so it was all theoretical. But there was this chap named John Tyndall in 1859, and the picture you see here is some elaborate apparatus that he created to measure the ability of certain gases to trap heat. And he put all kinds of different gases in there, nitrogen and oxygen and so on. And he was the one who proved that carbon dioxide traps infrared radiation. Now, my kid, the one I showed you in the photograph before, she's a first-year student at a different university, almost as good as McMaster. And she's a science student, and in her second lab of the year, they demonstrated the heat-trapping properties of carbon dioxide. So this is not even rocket science, it's an old science, it's first-year university science demonstrating that carbon dioxide traps heat. And this is a problem because the modern economy is built on the consumption of fossil fuels, which of course the combustion of them puts carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And so this slide that you see here is from NASA, so some pretty smart folks, the type who shoot rockets to the moon and Mars and so on. And what it shows is carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere going back over 800,000 years. You're probably wondering, how do we know what the atmosphere was like 800,000 years ago? Well, actually, if scientists go to places like Antarctica and Greenland and they drill cores out of the ice cap, ice builds up year after year, just like rings in a tree. And so you go right down to the base of the ice cap, which was put there hundreds of thousands of years ago, you extract the core, and there is air trapped in the ice core. And so there's the air that can be analyzed to see what its carbon dioxide concentrations were. And as you can see from this graph, from 800,000 years ago until about 50 years ago, carbon dioxide in the atmosphere behaved in a very particular pattern. I guess if the way you're looking at it is like that. And then suddenly in the 20th century, it just rockets, literally like a NASA rocket going to the moon. And so we are now over 400 parts per million carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. That's well beyond where scientists have been warning for decades we don't want to go. Because that's when the climate starts to behave in unpredictable and dangerous ways, dangerous for human well-being. And so you can see it's going up, and it's still going up as we speak. And we know what's causing it, right? We know it's the combustion of fossil fuels, the burning of coal, oil, and natural gas. We also know that certain activities like making cement or making steel, very popular activity in this part of the world, also produces large amounts of carbon dioxide and releases it to the atmosphere. And this is exacerbated by the fact that in many parts of the world we've been reducing the amount of forests on the planet. And of course, when plants are photosynthesizing, they take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and they lock it in their tissues, right? So this is carbon that was once in the air and is now in the stick and will stay in the stick so long as the stick is well looked after. As we deforest the planet, which we've been doing, it's estimated about half of the original forest cover of the planet that was here 1,000 years ago is now lost. That ability, that carbon that is locked in the tissues of those plants is no longer being locked, and it's up there in the atmosphere. So that carbon sink is missing. So the carbon dioxide levels keep going up. And one of the consequences is because carbon dioxide traps heat, the average global temperature goes up as well. And so what this chart shows, and it's from the US National Ocean and Atmospheric Administration, this goes back to the 1880s. That's back when we had reasonably good thermometer-based temperature readings for a large area of the Earth. And then if you cast forward to today, what you can see is that there is a clearly emerging trend, is that we are about 1.1 to 1.2 degrees Celsius warmer today than the atmosphere was on average 120, 150 years ago. It doesn't sound like a lot, right? 1 degree, 1.1 degrees Celsius. This room will probably warm up by about 1 degree Celsius over the course of my talk from all of this body heat in here, and we may not even notice it, right? But in nature, you notice it for sure, right? The difference between minus 0.5 degrees Celsius and plus 0.5 degrees Celsius is a change of state from solid water to liquid water, right? So around here, you know, in the wintertime, our winters aren't as cold as they used to be, and so people who skate outside lose the opportunity to go skating for several weeks out of the year from that very small change in temperature. And actually, the change in temperature, 1.1 degrees Celsius, that's a global average, but some parts of the globe are warming up more than others. Canada is one of those areas that's warming up faster than the average. And that has implications, obviously. In the case of Canada, and these three images are all from Canada, and they're all from this year, it means a hotter climate means greater fire risk, and we saw that this year. The scale of forest fires this year, in terms of the spatial scale in Canada, was literally off the charts. It was 500% larger, the area burned this year, than the average for the last decade, the average annual amount. So it's completely off the charts. The number of fires actually didn't change all that much. It only went up by about 10%. But because it was so hot and dry this summer, starting right in the month of May, that the fires just got out of control really quickly, and there's not much we could do about it. And they happened from British Columbia to Nova Scotia and right up into the Northwest Territories, and we saw images of people being evacuated from Yellowknife in August. The pictures you see here are of West Kelowna, BC. The lower right image is from Hurricane Lee, which came ashore just about 2 weeks ago in Atlantic Canada. There's another storm heading for Atlantic Canada right now. It's a tropical storm. We'll see how much rain and wind it brings. One of the realities is that as we warm up the planet, we increase the frequency and/or the severity of these extreme weather events. And then the upper right-hand photo, that's from Alberta, where they've been stuck in a really severe drought for much of this year, and so farmers are having to sell off cattle. And that's a big problem for global food prices, actually, because Canada is one of the biggest exporting countries for grains and pulses. And we're in the midst of a drought out west. Crop yields are down this year, and there's a conflict going on in Ukraine right now. Ukraine also historically has been a big exporter of food. So what that means is that this winter, food prices are likely to go up around the world, especially in countries that import a lot of grain or pulses, places in South Asia, the Middle East, Africa in particular. And so there's going to be those sorts of challenges too. That's just what's happening right now. Of course, these things are going to get worse in coming years, and adding to them going to be rising sea levels. And the sea level rises for two reasons. One is as water warms, it expands in volume. So as we heat the surface layer of the ocean, all that warm air that's in contact with the ocean warming up the sea surface literally expands and rises. Plus, we are melting ice caps in Antarctica and on Greenland, where that water is currently on land, frozen, but as it melts, it drains into the oceans. So we've got sea levels rising at the current rate, about 3 millimeters per year, maybe 3 to 4 millimeters per year. Doesn't sound like much, 3, 6, 9, 12. You can see what's going on. Pretty soon, within 10 years, I can't get my fingers apart, any farther apart. And of course, may not matter much here in Hamilton. If the sea level rises all the way up here, we've really got problems. But if you live in a small island state in the Pacific, it means that by the time your grandchildren become elders, there may no longer be an island for them to live on. So these are very real problems. And in South Asia, average summertime temperatures are now reaching the point where it is actually dangerous to be outside. It gets so hot in the summertime. And we saw that this summer. Temperatures well up into the 40s. I think parts of Western China actually hit 50 degrees or something like that this summer. Like, that is beyond where physiologically we as humans can function out of doors. So we either need to be in air conditioning or very, very deep shade with lots of cold drinks. And of course, these sorts of impacts hurt the poorest of us the most, right? So let's talk about what I was asked to come here and speak about, which is people being forced to leave their homes. Now, the word refugee has a specific legal meaning under a United Nations convention, right? And it's reserved for people who have experienced persecution because of gender or ethnicity or all sorts of different reasons, but persecution and have had to flee their home country to seek safety. That is the official convention definition of a refugee. But before World War II, the term refugee was used much more widely to mean, in practical terms, anybody who is forced from their home for any reason. So back in the 1930s, in Canada, we had massive droughts in Western Canada in the midst of an economic downturn. And people fled their homes in Saskatchewan and Alberta and moved to British Columbia. Government referred to them as refugees. There was no convention at the time. But anyhow, the point being is that, I keep hitting my mic. Sorry about that, folks, on the video. But the point I want to get at is I'm not going to get hung up on the definition. I simply want to talk about people who are forced to move against their wishes because of the direct or indirect impacts of extreme weather events and slow onset events linked to climate change. The slides that you see here, this comes from the report on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that came out in 2022. I helped put this together. It's based on statistics that come from an organization called the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center in Geneva. And what they do is each year globally they count up the number of people who have had to leave their homes temporarily or permanently because of extreme weather and because of conflict or violence. What you see here is the average over the decade 2010 to 2020. And what you can see is that on average about 20 million people per year were displaced by extreme weather events. Most of them in Asia, most of them by storms or floods, many of them in India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh in particular, but other countries as well, China, the Philippines, and Southeast Asian countries as well, Vietnam in particular. Africa also has large numbers of people displaced. There it's also floods, but droughts start to figure into things. Here in North America, we have the additional threat of wildfires, especially in Canada and the Western US. But as you can see here, we know precisely, on average, how many people are already being displaced from their homes, on average, by the impacts of climate change. Last year, 2022, was an especially bad year. 32 million people around the world were displaced from their homes, primarily by floods and storms, but also by droughts and wildfires. That number is significant, one, because it's way above average, and two, there were actually more people displaced by extreme weather than by violence and conflict last year. So the environment is starting to become the key agent of displacement around the world. This is not to minimize or trivialize the fact that people are still being made refugees by violence and conflict, but just to show you that the trend is to essentially increase because of changing climate and environmental conditions. And again, we can see up at the top the 5 countries that experienced the most people displaced in that year. Now, some of those people may get to go home, but others may never get to go home. And the World Bank has warned that if we continue on the way that we are currently going, that means the type of economies that we have where we keep burning coal, oil, and natural gas at ever-increasing levels, and if we continue to ignore the poverty and underdevelopment in many parts of the world and the vulnerability of people in many parts of the world, things are going to get much worse quickly. They've projected, but by the year 2050, which is not all that far into the future. I hope to see 2050. I hope many people in this room will go well beyond that. That if we do continue on the way we're on, in a worst case scenario, over 200 million people around the world will be displaced from their homes by the impacts of climate change. Now, that's a worst-case scenario. However, the World Bank also warns, or also projects, that if we actually do something about it, we can avert that worst-case scenario. The window is still open to change our ways. And if we do so, we could reduce that number by 80%. I actually think that's an understatement. I think we could actually reduce below what we currently experience in terms of environmental displacement. We could get it lower than it is today. That is a possibility. But the thing I want to emphasize is that this isn't some radical environmental organization. This is not Greenpeace. This is not Greta Thunberg and her friends warning. That's the World Bank, right? Now, this is, talk about a conservative, fiscally conservative organization warning world leaders that you better change your ways because we got problems, right? So if they are the ones who are warning us, then we probably better heed their warning. One thing that often comes up in this conversation is, will it lead to greater levels of violence and conflict? In other words, if environmental displacements go up, will they drag with them the number of people displaced for reasons of conflict? And this is where the science is very unclear. Everything seems very much context specific. People who are in the know and who study this phenomena, tend to go very cautiously. Because let's face it, droughts happen all the time. That doesn't mean to say, oh no, I'm a farmer, I've experienced drought, I'm going to go hit my neighbor over the head now and steal something from him. That's not how people normally function, right? But what they do suggest is that these extreme weather events, they increase the risk that people who are already in situations where they're in competition or conflict, that it will exacerbate or make those situations worse. Security analysts in the military in the United States, the UK, and elsewhere call climate change a threat multiplier. In other words, there are existing threats, you layer on these extreme weather events, and it increases the chances of new conflict or additional conflict. And a good example of where this affects Canadians is that, I don't know if anybody has seen this in the news, but this week, actually this month, I guess, not this week, Canada has started to, and the United Nations have withdrawn from the country of Mali in West Africa. Canada has been engaged there for, I think, going close to 10 years now, as part of a peace-building, peacekeeping initiative by the UN. Mali is one of these states that is quite fragile in terms of its political stability. And so Canadian peacekeepers have been among those who've been trying to maintain peace in that part of the world. One of the challenges that they faced, and the peacekeepers themselves identified, is this persistent drought condition in the northern part of the country. And science has shown that that part of Africa is consistently hotter and drier than it historically was. And so what it does, again, is it amplifies the risk of conflict and violence in that part of the world. So I'm not saying that climate change caused the Malian conflict, but what I'm saying is it doesn't help matters. It doesn't help matters at all. If anything, it makes them worse. Okay, I'm getting towards the end of the canned part of the presentation and getting ready to give you folks a chance to have the floor. But I want to talk about three things. Does anyone know the song, 3 is a Magic Number? You know, yeah, I see some people nodding about reduce, reuse, recycle. I'm not going to sing that to you. But I do want to talk about three things because I want to get to the solutions pathway. In one sense, we already have all the tools, legal instruments, knowledge, and technology necessary to make that transition away from a future where hundreds of millions of people get displaced from their homes to a future where we actually reduce the number of people who are displaced from their homes and where we achieve greater cooperation, greater political stability, greater economic growth, and many of the principles that Gandhi was hoping that we as a global society would achieve as well. The first thing is we need to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. This country, we have talked about it long enough. Since the 1990s and the Kyoto Protocol, Canada, the government of Canada, has been promising to the world, we will reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. It's getting to the point where people in other countries don't believe a word we say anymore, certainly not on climate policy, because they've had 2 decades of excuses and empty promises. What this chart shows, and this is a Government of Canada chart, this is Canada's annual greenhouse gas emissions. And so we have promised that by 2030, we will reduce our national greenhouse gas emissions to levels that are 40% below what they were in the year 2005. So you can see the arrow is pointing, that's the base year, 732 megatons of greenhouse gas emissions. And we want to get that down to about 60% of that number by 2030, and then by the year 2050, get it down close to zero. When they talk about net zero, that's what they mean, no greenhouse gas emission. There can be greenhouse gas emissions in this part of the economy, but they have to be offset by reductions in other parts of the economy. As you can see, I've added the 2 dotted lines there. We have a big task in front of us to hit that level by 2030. Now, the numbers there end in 2021. The 2022 numbers will come out any time now. They're going to be higher. We're going in the wrong direction. The only reason they went down, as you can see at the tail end of this chart, is because we had the pandemic and we shut down a lot of our industry for a couple of years. People were staying at home, they weren't driving, so our emissions go down. But as soon as the economy roars back to life, so do the greenhouse gas emissions. So we're going like this when we need to be going like this in a hurry. But my point is that we have the technology to do this, right? This is not Star Trek or Star Wars type technology. This is technology now that is making its way into the economy, and the onus is upon the government to make that technology more easily available to all, and for us as individuals to start embracing those technologies as they become affordable. Second thing we need to do, this is number 2, is the Sustainable Development Goals. Our Prime Minister was in New York just a couple weeks ago at the opening of the latest session of the United Nations, and that week was dedicated to climate change and achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. So these SDGs, as they're known, they were set in 2015, and they're to be achieved by the year 2030. I won't go into all the details of all 17 goals, but essentially they're things that really as a human society we should have achieved 50 years ago, but we're still struggling with. Poverty, children not going to school, gender discrimination, people going hungry, and so on. We have promised by the year 2030, we being Canadians and Americans and Malians and every government around the world, have promised we will cooperate and work together to try and achieve these goals. But we are backsliding on many of them. The pandemic hit our country very hard, and a lot of poor people and vulnerable people in our communities very hard. It caused even worse harm in poor communities in poorer countries around the world. In some parts of the world, the hunger rate has actually gone up over the last 5 years. So we're going in the wrong direction again. So we really need to double down on achieving these goals, because the reality is this: if folks are happier, healthier, wealthier, better fed, better educated in poorer parts of the world, they won't be so poor for so long, and they'll be better able to cope with and adapt to the inherent challenges of living in a disrupted climate. As long as we continue to ignore the poverty, hunger, and all these other challenges in poorer countries and poorer parts even of our own communities, we just make more and more vulnerability as we go along. And so that has to change in a hurry. And the third thing is that we are living in a time where migrants are being demonized all around the world. We are putting up fences. We are using military-grade technology to track the movement of migrants on boats and on land on different continents, and doing our best to keep them out. In many cases, they're being prevented and denied a legal right that they have in our country, right? In Canada, the United States, the EU, it is your legal right to come and make a refugee claim if you believe you are subject to persecution in your home country. And that is legal under British law, French law, Canadian law. And so what we do is we prevent them from getting to our territory, and that way they can't act upon that legal right. And so it's a terrible narrative. And I should tell you I'm biased. My mom's an immigrant, my wife's an immigrant, so I'm kind of pro-immigrant, as you might imagine. But the point being is that this narrative has to change. We need to figure out, how do we make migration work for ourselves, for the sending countries, and the people who are moving to our country. And many of them are going back as well. And there is something called the Global Compact on Migration. It's a UN document. It's not a binding agreement, though Canadians and others have signed on to it. And if anybody actually reads it, it provides a wonderful blueprint for how to deal with changes in migration patterns in a climate-disrupted world. People sat down and thought this through and told global policymakers, here's what can happen, here's what you ought to do, here's how you minimize the harm caused, and so on. So we sign off on these things, but we don't actually follow through. So there's 3 things that our communities and our governments can do to tackle this challenge. Now, this is my final slide that I want to share with you, and it's our to-do list as individuals, right? And I wanted to call this, but I was hesitant to do so because I didn't know whether it would fit or not. But Gandhi's mantra was non-cooperation with an unjust government. We have to start thinking about how we are no longer going to cooperate with the fossil fuel economy and the people who benefit from the fossil fuel economy. And it won't happen overnight. I got here driving an automobile powered by gasoline. So I'm a hypocrite as much as anybody else out there. It's a 2015 Volkswagen. I'll keep driving it, but the next car will not be a gasoline-powered automobile. That's the kind of decisions each and every one of us need to be making on big scales with capital purchases, like with our homes and our automobiles and so on, but also in our smaller day-to-day decisions as well. How can I make simple choices that reduce my personal greenhouse gas footprint? And if all of us did that and worked in the same way, we can't solve the problem, but we are on the pathway, right? We are on the pathway. And it's not just simply cutting greenhouse gas emissions. It means participating in the social life of our communities, right? Because we need stronger communities now more than ever, right? Because the challenges we face are changing rapidly and getting more ominous, for lack of a better word. And the only way we get through all of this is by working together and not working against one another, right? So even doing little things, to build our community. It may not be aimed at climate change, but it's aimed at the greater good, and that's what we need right now. We need to spend more time in nature. I fear very much for my students, and I'm speaking primarily to the students in the audience now, who have grown up in places that don't have many trees, that don't have any green spaces, places to play, and so on. That's where you learn about nature, and that's where you learn about yourself. It's not locked in a room doing your homework like this. I mean, you still have to do your homework, don't get me wrong. Do well in school, get good grades, but you need to build time into your world, into your routine, to expose yourself to nature. I'll go off on a little tangent here just to say, in Japan there's this phenomena called Shinrin-yoku. Maybe you've heard of it. It's called forest bathing. So large cities in Japan have very little green space, poor air quality, high heat, and all this kind of a nasty urban environment. People will deliberately go into the forest for a day, for a holiday, and just breathe the air, walk around and breathe the air. They call it forest bathing. And so you can imagine that psychologically, mental health reasons, reducing anxiety, just going for a walk in the woods would be good for you. And it is, and this has been proven clinically time and time again. But the interesting part is that medical researchers in Japan did experiments where they took university students and gave them little holidays in the woods, and then took a different group of university students as a control group and gave them a holiday but in another urban setting. And before the students left, they filled in questionnaires about their mental health and well-being, but they also gave blood samples. They come back after the holidays, and everybody reported feeling really good after having a few days off school, off free vacation. Who wouldn't have better mental health after that? The forest folks, they were maybe a little bit higher in terms of their reporting of this, but the interesting thing was in the blood work. The immune system of the students who went to the forest was elevated. It was functioning better than the control group. And the reason is that trees exude chemicals called phytoncides into the atmosphere, into the air around them. And these are kind of like their antibiotics that they put out into the air to protect themselves from fungi, from rusts, from other diseases that affect trees. They put them out into the air, these little microscopic particles. And when you breathe them in, it's like medicine for your immune system. It just energizes your immune system. And the neat thing about it is that the effect lasts for several weeks. So the message in this is, yes, going for a walk in the woods is good for your mental health, but it's also good for your physical health. So at this time of year when your professors are giving you all kinds of assignments and midterms and forcing you to come out to my lecture to get a participation grade in your course, that would never happen. Take a friend and go for a little walk. You've got some nice green space around here. Go for a walk among the trees. It'll be good for your mental health, be good for your physical health. And again, speaking to the students in here, you are masters at social media. You can use it to share cat videos or homecoming parties or all kinds, and do it, socialize in it as well. But use social media to be the type of change, to foster the type of change you'd like to see in society, right? So use as well your expertise on Instagram and TikTok and other media to to start promote the values that we want to see happen, both in terms of the environment and social justice and other things as well. You've got the skills. Old folks like me, I'm on TikTok, believe it or not, and I've got a few followers, got a few thousand followers, and I do a few videos. My students told me to get on TikTok, essentially, about a year ago, because I found out that, and the students can confirm this for me if it's true or not. I'm sorry you sat up front and I'm looking at you. But I hear that when you folks want information, you don't do Google searches anymore, because that just gives you text answers, and what you want is a video where somebody explains it to you. I've heard this. You don't have to confirm whether it's true or not. So I asked my daughter, who's in university, so is this true? And she goes, yeah, it's sort of true. And I said, well, how do you know if the information's real or not? She said, well, if it's got the most likes, it's probably better. It's like, ugh! So I said, okay, students, I'm going to start putting mini lectures and snippets from my lectures onto TikTok. I'm going to poison TikTok for you. I'm going to put fact-based information on TikTok. So I've been doing this. So it's worked out well. Anyhow, the point being, social media can be a power for good. Please use it for that. And finally, well, that's not finally. I've got two more. One is vote. We have to vote. If we don't vote, we don't get the government that we want. And young people, students, you don't vote in nearly as many numbers as you ought to, because you vote in small percentages compared to us older folks who all vote diligently. And so what happens is governments cater to those who vote and those who donate money to them. Now, I realize as students you don't have a lot of money to donate them, but you do have your votes you could give them. So you need to leverage that power, right? Because if you want governments to take action on student loans and unaffordable housing and difficulty finding good entry-level jobs in the professions you want, the governments aren't going to do that for you or help you with it unless you say, I'll vote, but only if you do this stuff. Otherwise, they listen to folks like me who worry about stuff that folks like me worry about, right? So vote. But of course, don't vote for politicians who refuse to act in the manner that we need them to act on the environment, on society, and on sustainable economic prosperity. And finally, and I think this is coming back to the name of the person who, for whom this lecture series is named, we need to be compassionate for one another. And that seems to be in declining popularity, compassion, and we need to revive that as well, and do that by whatever means you can. I think I've gone on more than long enough, and I think it's time for you folks to get a chance to speak and add your opinions and ask questions. But again, thank you very much to everyone who made it possible for me to be here and speak to you today. Thank you.